Spacing didn't exist in Korea until the late 1800s, so everything was written just without a space. However, at that time, Hanja was used a lot more often, so spacing really wasn't as important. You can tell what the different words are because Hanja was used to kind of break them apart. In this video, I'm not going to go over every single exception to spacing. This is just going to be an outline of all the most important rules when spacing. But that's good enough. In fact, most native Koreans don't even know spacing. Most have to learn it themselves in order to get good at it. And spacing is a gigantic topic in Korean. Really, there are so many rules and exceptions, and even if I can space better than the average native Korean, I still mess up sometimes. And some spacing can be humorous. Let me just give you an example of a common joke you might hear about spacing. 아버지가 방에 들어가신다. So dad goes into the room. Well, if you wrote this without spaces, it could also be 아버지 가방에 들어가신다. So dad goes into the bag. So spacing is important. That's really all I wanted to say with this joke. Before we go over all of these rules, I want to be very clear. Do not stress about spacing rules. Because frankly, nobody cares. Now, of course, if you're writing an essay in Korea, then yeah, people will care. Other than that, nobody cares if you space something correctly or not. In fact, if you'd like to just skip this whole video, you just want to have perfect spacing, well, I'm going to link a couple tools in the video description where you can copy and paste what you're writing, and it'll tell you if you're using correct spacing or not. And I'll talk about that a little bit more in depth at the end of these spacing rules if you'd like to learn more about that. Okay, so let's get started with our first spacing rule. The most basic spacing rule you need to know, and the most important, is to put a space between every individual word. Do not space, however, particles and markers though. For example, 저는 한국을 좋아해요. I like Korea. You'll still attach markers and particles, but you will not attach individual words. So there will still be a space between each of these individual words. 저, I, 한국, Korea, and 좋아하다, to like. Again, don't add a space between a word and its marker or particle, but do add a space after, as you can see. This also includes if you have an adjective and a noun or an adverb and a verb. Add a space because they're separate words. And this is the most fundamental rule, so if you just learn this one, you're gonna have better spacing already. There is an exception, however. Anytime you're using any verb with 하다 and the object marker with a noun. Now, there are lots of verbs like this. For example, 공부하다, to study. Well, if you're using the object marker, you will put a space, as you would expect. However, if you remove the object marker from these sorts of verbs, you must also remove the space. So that would just become 공부하다 without any space in between, like that. If you space them, it's technically wrong. Another exception where you don't want to add a space is with the verb 이다, to be. So if you wanted to say I am Billy, you just say 저는 빌리예요. There is no space here ever. But this is only with 이다. If you're using the verb 아니다, to not be, well, this one's used with the subject marker and you would put a space after that. So this one is not directly attached. Another example is 저는 갈 거예요. I will go. It's attached directly. However, 갈 from the verb 가다 and 거, meaning a thing, are separate words, so they are separated with a space here and here. The next type of verb is auxiliary verbs, and these can be spaced or you don't have to, so it's optional. Auxiliary verbs are any verbs that are used to help in a grammar form, but they're not used literally. Two common examples would be 보다, to see, or 주다, to give. If you have 먹어 보다, literally to try eating something, to taste something, or you can have 해 주다, like doing something as a favor for someone. Well, you could put a space here, or you can remove it, and it's equally acceptable. Now, this is not for just the verb 보다, to see, but again, it's when it's used as an auxiliary verb, in which case it's optional. Both of these options are acceptable. One more thing though about auxiliary verbs is it's technically a little bit more correct, a little bit more proper to space them, but it's acceptable to not. So if you were writing an essay and you really want it to look extra fancy and perfect, well then add a space, but if you don't space it, it is not wrong. Another place that you want to add a space, and this is often forgotten, I think even by natives, is between a name and a title. For example, if I'm going to be talking to my friend Hyunwoo, well, I would call him Hyunwoo Shi, here with a space. Now, don't put them together, make sure these are spaced. And this happens anytime you're using any title. So Shi is a title, but it would also work for any other title like 선생님 or 회장님, president, like that. When it comes to compound words, you actually do not want to space them. Now, a compound word is any two nouns that are used together as one new word. For example, 눈, meaning eye, and 물, meaning water, come together to mean tears. But this is used as a compound word, so you would never want to space these, or it would become the original meaning again, eye, water, which would sound really awkward. So then how do you tell if a word is a compound word? Well, just check it in the dictionary. If it comes up as its own entry, it's a compound word and you don't need to space it. When it comes to proper nouns, well, you actually just have to memorize how each one prefers to space. So this one, you'll just have to follow what's already written on their website or on a pamphlet. For example, 국립국어원 is the National Institute of the Korean Language, and although 국립 and 국어원 are separate words, it's written as one. This will typically be like government organization names, such as this one, so you don't really need to go out and memorize them. Just as you learn them, pay attention to how they space their own names. This one I know looks a little bit weird, but officially, whenever you're using a number and a counter, you're supposed to have a space between each number and each counter. So 2:10 p.m. or whatever would be 2시 10분, so 2 o'clock and 10 minutes, like that, with a space here, here, and here. Yeah, it looks weird. And in fact, it looks so weird that even the official rules say that although you're supposed to do this, it's perfectly acceptable to combine similar words together with numbers and their counters. So you can also just do this. 2시 as one word without a space here, 10분, 10 minutes. And this is perfectly acceptable. Please do it this way, it looks better. And if you're writing numbers using only Hangul, which isn't very common, but if you are, then you're also supposed to put a space every 10,000 digit. So if you're going to be having a large number, well, every 10,000s, you would have a space between the next set, like that. However, the only time you're ever going to write numbers with Hangul like that is if you're making a language textbook. Really, and you want the learner to be able to practice how to read them. Everyone just writes using normal numbers, so don't really worry about that rule too much. Some words are also written together without a space by default. 이분, 그분, 저분, when you're talking about this, that, or that person, as well as 이것, 그것, and 저것, for this thing, and that thing over there. So these are written always without a space. However, some verbs are just exceptions and they'll have their own rules, and that might not even match what the grammar form normally does. For example, if you have 고 싶다, which is the form that means you want to do something, well, it can become 고 싶어 하다 when you attach 하다 to the end with a space. However, this form, 하다, attaching to the end of a conjugated verb, a descriptive verb, normally doesn't add a space. So 슬프다 would just become 슬퍼 하다. So only this verb, 싶다, becomes 싶어 하다 with a space. Another example is 하다, which can become 해보다 with a space, or as I said before, without a space, but the verb 묻다, to ask, always becomes 물어보다 without a space. It's just doing its own thing. So if you want perfect spacing, you'll just have to memorize these exceptions as they come up. And some words will actually change their meaning depending on how they're spaced. Now, not a lot of words, but a really common one is Hanbon. Now, Han, literally one time, pon, and Hanbon, originally the same meaning but without a space. Of course, when you're saying these out loud, there's no difference in how you'd pronounce them, but when writing them, these two words have different meanings. Hanbon literally means once, one time, whereas Hanbon is used for when you're suggesting something like sometime, like, hey, let's go get a meal sometime, literally once, let's get a meal once. So anytime you're saying that you're gonna give something a try, 한번 해볼게, I'll try it once, well then you actually want to use 한번 as like sometime, I'll give it a try. And if you're saying I'm going to do it once, well then you would say 한번 with a space. Just memorize that one. Now, here's a tip. If you want to know the spacing of any word, of course you can check it in a dictionary, but in other ways you can type the word and then write 띄어쓰기, literally spacing, right after the word, and you'll be able to see an article will pop right up with nearly every word about the exact spacing and why it's spaced that way. One thing though I do want to say is that the best way to learn spacing is actually just to learn words with proper spacing while you're learning them. So the first time that you see a new word, just look at the spacing. You know, you don't have to really study the spacing, just kind of pay attention to how words are spaced when you first learn them. That'll help you later on to have good spacing without having to go back and learning all of these rules, and you'll just know them naturally because you've been paying attention to them. And that's what I did. So then you followed all of these rules and you want to know, am I spacing something correctly? Well, I've got a treat for you. In the video description, I provided 2 links to some artificial intelligence spacing checkers. Yes, and they actually are magical. They will work. 99%. Careful though, don't just blindly copy paste and save what it gives you because it doesn't understand actually any Korean. So basically just check everything that it tells you before you just blindly copy it and send it off to your friend. However, these are still great tools, and I know a lot of native speakers and other teachers who use them, and I use them as well too to verify my spacing. And finally, before we go, one more really important reminder about spacing. I think this is the most important rule. Nobody cares. Just do your best. Just do your best. That's all you have to do. Just try your best. Good luck with these spacing rules. Let me know if there's any that I missed in the comments or any other thing you'd like to learn about spacing. I'd be happy to maybe make another video about this if there's something important that I didn't talk about today. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you again in another video. 그럼 다음에 또 봐.